It's episode 200 of the Big Seance podcast. Can you believe it? And I finally got to sit down in the parlor with the handsome parapsychologist, Dr. Callum Cooper. It was around 2012 when I first discovered you and your work, and then I read your book, Telephone Calls from the Dead.
We found that the type 1 calls where someone has died, you pick up, you tend to just hear static, or sometimes just a voice saying someone's name where they recognize that voice characteristic. That seems to be in the majority in terms of those types of calls. They're the most common ones.
My son did phone back twice more, and we checked the lines, we checked everything, checked with the woman. The woman must have thought we were absolutely, completely mad because she didn't phone me.
I think it was the father who said that he'd had an unusual voicemail come through, and it was their daughter on repeat going, "Hi, Dad. Hi, Dad."
We're going to clear up some misinformation, like who really discovered EVP?
Bayless was quite annoyed because no one really paid attention to it. Parapsychologists generally weren't interested in it. And that same year, that's when Friedrich Jurgenson, who had the media contacts, came forward and spoke about his experiences. So he is popularly known as this discoverer of EVP, when if you check the history, he isn't.
And prepare to have your hearts broken, friends. Wait until you hear what he has to say about our beloved Estes Method. We get real, y'all. It's episode 200. Are you open to it?
Sometimes it's just really hard to get groups of ghost hunters to listen. They're not interested in someone being deemed a professional expert because they believe there is no such thing.
Welcome to the Big Seance podcast. I'm Patrick Keller of BigSeance.com, and this is a place for an open discussion on all things paranormal, but specifically topics like ghosts and hauntings, paranormal research, spirit communication, psychics and mediums, and life after death. So basically, anything that pops up in my paranormal world. The candles are already lit, so you might as well come on in and join the seance. I cannot believe it's episode 200 of the show. And even more unbelievable is that in just a few short months, we're approaching what will be the 10th anniversary of what started out as just a blog, BigSeance.com. So thank you for being here and for celebrating with me. It's a jam-packed show, which includes the second installment of the return of Tim Prasil's Spectral Edition. So let's get started. Dr. Callum E. Cooper is a chartered psychologist with the British Psychological Society and a fellow of the Higher Education Academy, holding postgraduate degrees in psychology, social science research methods, and education from the University of Northampton, Sheffield Hallam University, and Manchester Metropolitan University. He has a long-time association with the University of Northampton and is based there as a senior lecturer in psychology, delivering classes and conducting research on death and bereavement, positive psychology, human sexual behavior, parapsychology, and research methods. He is a member of organizations such as the Society for Psychical Research, a professional member of the Parapsychological Association, and a Hope Studies research affiliate. Callum is also on the Scientific Advisory Board for the Forever Family Foundation and for the Windbridge Research Center. Callum's main research has focused around bereavement and recovery, interlinked with applied positive psychology. He has also been noted for his work on altered states of consciousness, having spent a lot of time in the past few years working with flotation tanks and sensory deprivation. Throughout his time in research, he has traveled the world promoting science and the scientific method, as well as encouraging a skeptical approach to claims of exceptional human experiences. Callum is the author of various research papers and book chapters, and has also authored and co-edited several books, including Telephone Calls from the Dead, Conversations with Ghosts, and Paracoustics, Sound and the Paranormal. You can find more about Dr. Cooper by visiting CallumECooper.com. All right, welcome to the parlor, Dr. Cal Cooper. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Patrick, how are you?
I am so good. I have to tell people that you are such a kind man that when we first connected to do this interview, it was shortly before Halloween. And it never happens here, but our internet and Wi-Fi and cell service even just decided to take a break and be done for a whole evening. And I was able to connect on my phone well enough to see you and hear you. And even though you knew you weren't connecting for an interview, oh my gosh, we had the nicest conversation for like at least 40 minutes. And it was just so friendly and cool. And I've never chatted with you in person. And so people need to know you're a nice dude, but you're also sitting here with a pin in your foot.
Yes, that's still in
and
there.
And a sewing needle.
Sewing needle. It's good to talk, and it was a nice chat. But yeah, and you're now taking my mind off the fact that I've got a bit of pain in my foot. But if it stays in there any longer, I am going to force it to pay rent because it's quite cozy in there. But it's time to get out.
Oh, Cal says that he's not able. They don't have any availability right now, which is crazy in the hospital to do, an operation to get that sewing needle out. So, I can't imagine, but we are glad you're here with us and we are glad to entertain you and distract you from your pain.
Thank you so much. It's just a warning to everyone. Never try and sew your socks while you've got them still on.
The more you know, after school special. It was around 2012 when I first discovered you and your work. And then I read your book, Telephone Calls from the Dead, which led me to the earlier work of D. Scott Rogo and Raymond Bayless. And I remember seeing your interview on Jeff Belanger's old show, 30 Odd Minutes. You remember that?
Mm-hmm.
And I remember thinking, yes, we need a fresh and hip new generation of parapsychologists. So from that moment on, I knew I wanted to interview you at some point. It just took forever. So I thank you for your time and energy tonight.
No, my pleasure. I mean, we got there. I mean, that seems like a lifetime ago, and so many things have happened since then. It's been 10 years since I wrote Telephone Calls from the Dead, or a bit more, because I started initially writing it in 2009. At least I was dabbling with ideas as I was finishing my undergraduate degree. And as much as some people see it as the main thing that I'm known for, I think that's mainly in media circles that I'm known for that, just because I've done so many interviews on it, because it's what interests people the most. But in professional work, academic circles, I mean, it is my professional work because I was interviewing people and looking at accounts. But day to day, I deal with bereavement mainly and anomalous experiences associated with that, and altered states of consciousness, and sometimes lecture on sexual behavior as well. So I've got my foot in many different doors of psychology, really. But Telephone Calls from the Dead, I'm happy with it. The book served me well. But I did it privately as a publication. It was a small-time publishing house in Portsmouth on the south coast of the UK. And so there were only ever 1,000 copies. And so I need to get it done. So the copy that you have, treasure it. There won't be another one that looks like that, because I never get them printed again like that. They'll get done up again. I'll revise the book somehow, but it'll be back out again. The audience is clearly wanting more. I have constant requests for people asking for a copy of it. And, it shows that academics don't make good business people, because I'm losing out here on this opportunity to make money off the book that I own the most rights to, which is my first one. I don't lose so much to the publishing houses or anywhere else. And yet I haven't produced another version to sell on. So there we go. It'll come out again.
So I really own one of 1,000 copies.
You own one of 1,000 only printed. Yeah. And that was my first ever book.
That is very cool. Well, it also came out in a time where this is, not long after I started what I call my spiritual shift, my journey into being fascinated by any of this stuff. I didn't grow up having paranormal experiences or even being that interested. And so it was around 2009, 2010 where I started craving the books, and yours was definitely one of those. It's the only book of yours that I've read right now, but I have followed you and your work. And I do want to talk about the bereavement a little bit later, because I think that's fair and important to make sure we get your current stuff, out there so people know. And I'm interested in that stuff too.
So what caused your shift then? 2019, I mean, that sounds like fairly recent to get interest in people's
It is
exceptional experiences. So what caused your shift and interest?
I was like 30. So that is fairly late. It's really nerdy. Some people would be embarrassed about this, and, maybe I am a tad bit embarrassed, but it's a combination of like three things. It is a book, Ghosts Among Us by James Van Praagh. It is the Ghost Hunters series that my parents suggested I watch one day. And I was like, what? And then all of a sudden I was sucked in. And I always forget the third thing, but those things. And then I used to not even be a reader. I hated reading. And there for a while, for like a year or two, I was reading a book a week. But, I couldn't stop. And I craved it. And then all of a sudden it felt so awesome that like dogma and stuff that I'd been taught growing up I was losing all of that. And I didn't fear death anymore. And so it was kind of, I have a lot of memories from those couple of years in like the blogs I was reading and articles and books. That book stands out, definitely. And Telephone Calls from the Dead. I mean, that's a fascinating topic.
Yeah, I think Rogo and Bayless, that was their bestseller and the only joint thing that they'd ever done. But the title, I've heard probably a couple of interviews where Rogo had spoken about it, and it was one of the main things that the radio presenter wanted to bring up, the title. So it must have caught so much attention. They did 3 different prints of it. So it clearly caught the interest. But I'm glad that you said that you've gone from not really being interested in reading to then reading and going through a book a week. Even in the autobiography that I've just been reading recently for Billy Connolly, he talked about how the library saved him as a kid because it was his outlet to information in the world, and just this proud moment of being able to take out one book, and then got a bit older and you're allowed 2 books when you're a teen. And just the beauty of reading, because I was in the same position as you. Growing up, I struggled to read, and I think I struggled to read not because I couldn't. I've never been tested for dyslexia or anything like that. I don't think I am. I wouldn't engage with words and things like that because I would never find anything that would interest me enough to want to read.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, when I started hearing more and more about people's unusual experiences, that did fascinate me, because it's not anything that we would really discuss in school. It wouldn't really come up in religious studies or history or science. It just wasn't there. And we didn't study psychology either. So I realized that if I wanted to learn about this, and the internet was completely in its infancy at that time, I had to pick up the books at the local library. And we go down there once a week with school. I had a very small class. There was about 12 of us in my class. So me and 3 other guys, we'd go to the section that had paranormal books, probably about half a dozen of them, if that, but we just recycle them. We constantly switch them and take them out every week. And that's where I learned about Harry Price, the ghost hunter, and Borley Rectory, some of the initial photos that people thought they got of the Loch Ness Monster and Bigfoot. So I was reading everything from ghosts to claimed psychics to Fortean phenomena. And then by the time I was about to leave school, I actually started buying and sourcing out, because book websites were becoming more popular on the internet. I was getting textbooks for parapsychology, university level ones. And I was steadily, paragraph by paragraph, page by page, at night, late at the end of my bed, reading through this stuff, the stuff that even college teachers for psychology were saying there is no such thing as a parapsychologist. So if you're thinking about careers in it, don't. Which was nonsense, because I'm reading every page, all these various academics that had gained grants to do it, or they were working at university, this, that, and the other. And so it fascinated me. I started to pursue, well, who's doing this where, and how do you actually get involved in this? Mixed with other ambitions. I never thought I'd get involved in psychology or anything like that, but reading, yeah. I mean, sometimes it's completely your gateway to truth, or at least a fuller picture of what's going on, rather than, certain biased sources. So the books are the most important thing.
That is a common thing I hear from the people that I interview, because, most people in this field have been interested since the time they grew up. And they talk about how the only place they could go was their library or the books that they were finding. People from all kinds from an older generation to younger generation. I still hear that. I kind of feel like I missed out. Like, man, all the years I lost out on reading. I feel like I was trying to catch up for a while. And I still talk about the shelving ceremony that I have, because I have this very materialistic need to own the physical book. I cannot stand to read a digital book, I will if I have to, but then I also order the physical book after I read the digital book. And then it's like, I have a shelving ceremony where I pick where it's going to go and I stand back and look at it. It's really sad. Like,
I do it.
You have an amazing library behind you and some amazing looking, the dustier and older, the dustier and older they are. I'm so jealous. This is probably an overwhelming question, but do you have a good must read, a couple of books that, like, man, people need to have this on their shelf?
If it's an overview of parapsychology, and I recommend it again recently, but he's still a fellow of the University of Northampton. He's a US-based parapsychologist who has spent many years now in the UK and lives here in Oxford. Dr. Richard Broughton, he was, I think, the research director for many years at the Rhine Research Centre. His book, which has not been reprinted, but there are many copies still out there on the internet if you look, it's called Parapsychology, the Controversial Science. Came out about 1992. Many of the things in there are still relevant to this day, especially chapter 4, why does the controversy continue? And you can see its total relevance to where the internet is now, with people finding it controversial, but outside of the field who have no involvement. So you learn about, well, what are their conceptions about the field, and what platform do they have to kind of knock it down and try and resist it being seen as a science. And yet people like J.B. Rhine and Louisa Rhine, who founded the Duke Parapsychology Lab in the late 1920s, by the end of the 1960s, they'd already founded the Parapsychological Association to become this regulating body for parapsychology. And they got the American Association for the Advancement of Science to recognize the PA as an affiliate branch. And it still is to this day, but that was much to the disgruntlement of many scientists that didn't want it to be, without any good reason, really. There was many scientists as well that were perfectly happy for it to be there, saw it as and still do, as a frontier science that's looking at these aspects of psychology that are clearly well understood in terms of we acknowledge these reports and what people claim they are. We don't understand the full mechanisms. There's a good book by Stacy Horn called Unbelievable, which is a really nice summary of the journey that the Rhines went on to establish the Duke Parapsychology Lab. I read that when I was an undergrad. I just sat in the sunshine for a week and worked my way through it and really enjoyed that overview. I thought it was so helpful. So that's 2 books. Let me give you a third one just for the fun of it. So that's mainly parapsychology. Ghosts and apparitions, if we're kind of going down that route, there's a really good book by a dear friend of mine who's still in Nottingham, many years retired now, but Dr. Alan Gauld. He did a book called Mediumship and Survival. And it's a fantastic overview. But he also did a book called The Founders of Psychical Research. That is also a very good book to have as well. I could go on, but there's 3 for you. The Controversial Science, Richard Broughton, Unbelievable, Stacy Horn, and Mediumship and Survival, Alan Gauld.
I now have 3 books to search for and find because I haven't read any of those. So thank you for that.
Certainly start with Richard's. Do that.
Yeah. Okay. I know you said that there are obviously people out there who don't think that parapsychology exists, like they're in some alternative universe. But do you feel any kind of pressure to represent parapsychology as a younger person? Because to me, parapsychology is this, like, I don't think of parapsychology as being this young, hip kind of field right now. Do you feel pressure to take the field to a new level, or has it always been well represented?
I think it's always been well represented. I was in the position where I was working in or trying to work towards a career in performing arts. So I've always liked stage performance and things like that, and love the anxiety and the butterflies that you get when you're going to go on stage. even to the point that you feel like you're going to turn back and you're not going to do it. Because am I really going to get the audience to actually believe my performance? Or, will I remember what I need to say to actually convince my audience, draw them in? But I pursued psychology as something to just have and be used in many forms of employment if I never got the kind of career that I wanted in performing arts. And I think parapsychology has always seen young academics involved. But for a long time, there was always the worry, more so in the United States, that if you're going to pursue psychology and you're in your late teens, early 20s at university, and you've taken on a research position with someone who's there that is doing parapsychology, but their colleagues don't like to talk about it and things like that, that you get that research experience and they tell you why it's important and how it will help you with the rest of your psychology career. But that person's either been there long enough to make sure that there's no chance that the university would remove them, no matter what reason people have, a bigoted reason just about the topic of choice. The fact is they're doing really good thorough science with research methods that were established within parapsychology that the rest of social sciences started to use for themselves and became standard methods as they are to this day. Things like shielding, randomization, double-blind, triple-blind testing, meta-analyses, and we could go on. And so you'd often get the people that were in the limelight, I guess, being the more older generation and those that were retired and they'd already had an academic career, but they continued because they just didn't know how to stop and how to retire. I think when you're an academic, you just don't stop reading anyway. You've just learned that a thirst for knowledge is just good for your brain. And so you keep going. And so they might turn to their interest that they'd always had throughout their academic career for parapsychology and pursue it at a point that no one can stop them. And so that's when they'd start doing more. So that's probably why you saw the older generation for a long time. And then now there's very few places you'd find that have a justifiable problem with parapsychology that they could actually use to push to one side. I mean, I remember seeing some unusual reactions to people saying, "Oh, where are you based and what do you do?" "I'm based at such and such university. I'm involved in parapsychology." And you might get this sort of strange recoil, but then the person had to have explained to them what this was about. Or they'd already made up their mind. They said, "Oh, none of that stuff exists. Oh, there's no evidence for that." And yet you can go to any section of a library and say, "Well, you can't say this stuff doesn't exist in terms of the research. Of course it does." But you're denying that. I'm more than happy to kind of show you around and, you can peruse the journals to your heart's content. But also to say that there's no evidence for it or good evidence for it, that is also nonsense. I would like to know where you've gained that information from. But usually these are, pre-existing beliefs, ideas, their own lecturers and teachers have probably distilled this within them, or maybe even their family, religious representatives, peers, who knows? So you have some of those, what I consider now oldie-worldy backlashes from some areas of the academic community. But from my own experience, it's been nothing but positive. And so the moment I got any kind of media interest, I was pushed out the door by my own mentors to go and engage. And so had this passion, been able to relay it. I've only got better over time because I'm reading more, I'm doing more research, got more stuff under my belt. And so I enjoy being out there because there's that performance aspect, but then it's also trying to also better myself at making sure I'm relaying this message correctly and why it's important. What do we gain from this particular aspect of psychology? Why does anyone need to know about it? Why do we need to do any research on these kinds of areas? Yeah, I think it's just a time and perspective thing that's changed, really. I don't think there's really been a hidden younger generation. It's always been there. But there was always that caution just because of career prospects that I hope has changed. I hear from colleagues there's not been a great deal of change in the US because there aren't that many universities in the US within their psychology curriculum or maybe sociology, anthropology that have incorporated these kinds of whole taught modules or opportunities to do your dissertation on it. There's probably about 3, 4, 5, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And yet in the UK, there's at least a dozen with taught modules, and maybe even a dozen beyond that, where regardless of there being a taught course, there are staff members there who hold PhDs in parapsychology or some parapsychology theme or have practical research experience. So if you went there, you could do a research degree, you could do a Master's of Philosophy, PhD, or any other form of doctorate under them and include parapsychology. So probably, at a push, 24 universities that could support it.
And here in the US, we hear about a funding issue with parapsychology. Is that the case where you are too?
Some people might have their own ideas about it. I don't think there's a lot of funding out there. Certainly we have colleagues in the department that that see us getting grants for this, that, and the other. And they say, well, in our areas of educational psychology, child psychology, there doesn't seem to be a lot. And we're seeing you guys bring in loads. But I think we've just become quite used to knowing where these pockets of funding are and filling in, grant forms and ideas about projects and so forth. And just knowing the system so we can get this money in so we can get new PhD students. But over time, we get very small bits of funding, a few £100 here and there to a few thousand, and we call that seed corn funding, as though this is the initial seed that plants the tree, and it gives us enough to produce a pilot study. When we've got that pilot study out there, it's something to present to the bigger funders of, look, we'd like to take this to the next step. It's only with bigger funding that we could do that. So there are bigger funders such as Bial. They're a pharmaceutical company based in Porto. They're probably one of our bigger funders. There's the Perrott Warwick Scholarship, Trinity College, University of Cambridge. But over time, though, parapsychology has worked on very little person power. A lot of people that took it up after they retired. A lot of people put their own funds into it to get things done on projects on their own budgets, their own funds. And it's managed to produce, as much as it has to this day, quite an impressive amount on very little funding. So it is there, the funding is there, but it's not enough to have a parapsychology department at every single university, but it's enough to keep us going and sometimes get some really good projects completed. So if anyone wants to know more about that, just email me. When it comes to educational opportunities in parapsychology, research funding, I can be very boring on email and tell you all about that in detail and point you in the right direction. But it is there. It's surely not as big as it is compared to places like chemistry, physics, and medicine when you're looking for some good funding over many years to really discover, what's going on with this disease, what's going on with these chemicals and chemical reactions going on. I've no idea. I'm not a chemist, but the funding's there and it's bigger and they've got more people involved and they've got more grounding in their science because they've been about longer as well. So we're still a baby science, and that's why we're tootling along. The funding increase over time, the people increase over time, but we're still getting there.
I do want to get to learning about your work with bereavement and recovery, but I mentioned on social media a couple of weeks after we connected and mentioned that you were going to be on the show and asked if people had some questions. Mm-hmm. And I had the most wonderful woman named Charlotte who actually sent me a voicemail. And that doesn't happen very often. I have a hotline. And so I have about a 3-minute voicemail with some comments about some telephone calls from the dead. I'm so impressed that she called and wanted to talk to you or leave this message. So I'm going to play that and then we'll get your feedback on the other end.
Hiya, I just want to give you feedback on the telephone communication from spirits. I live in England, so excuse me for my accent. I've had 2 experiences of this. Well, sorry, 3. The first one was when my grand's second husband died, and she was quite poorly in hospital, and I got a phone call. I had my ex-husband in the room, my children in the room. The phone audibly rang. I picked the phone up and it sounded like static electricity in the background. And very clearly in the background, I could hear my grand's husband saying, Charlotte, and he said it 3 times. The reason why I know it was my grand's second husband is because he had a very, very deep North Devon accent, and it was, you couldn't mistake it for anybody else. And I live in the north of England. He lived in the southwest of England. So it was very bizarre. I took the 3 Charlottes as saying, oh, maybe she's got 3 weeks or 3 months to live, because she was seriously ill at the time. It turned out into 3 weeks, and we managed to get down there and help my gran and all sorts. Hiya, it's Charlotte again from the UK. I'll tell you about my second experience. My son died in April, and we were all distraught, but I wasn't asking him to communicate. I wasn't reaching out to him in any way, shape or form. I was busy trying to sort out the funeral, trying to sort out my other children, and trying to get ahead of things. Again, my mobile phone rang with a number. At the time, I was expecting phone calls from the coroner and people like that because it was an unexpected death. So I picked the phone up and it was an electronic voice saying goodbye. And then it went, the phone call ended. So my daughter, my oldest daughter, his sister, phoned the number up, and the number was a woman that I had never contacted before. She had not made the phone call at all, and there was no record of the phone call on her side. But it was a very, very clear goodbye. So that's my second one. And that was very, very clear, very clear. And the woman could not explain it whatsoever. And that was so weird, But my son, they're always with you, aren't they? So, and he loved technology. He was autistic, he loved technology. So maybe he was just using his technology, his ability to manipulate it. I don't know, but it's very interesting. My son did phone back twice more. And we checked the lines, we checked everything, checked with the woman. The woman must have thought we were absolutely, completely mad because she didn't phone me, And my son's phone was with the police because it was an unexpected death through no fault of his own. And they could not unlock his phone. Okay, so nobody could get into his phone. So I can't still get into his phone. Nobody can. I just think my son wanted to say goodbye to me. It's awful losing a child. And I did take some comfort from it. And I'm sure he did. And I'm sure he's absolutely enjoying his time over there in spirit. He has done some other awesome things that I don't know whether you'd like to hear about or not. And I've got a few videos and EVPs. So I don't make things up either. They're very, very clear EVPs. They're not things you have to manipulate to hear them. You don't have to manipulate anything. Let me know if you want to hear about them anyway. And thank you from the UK. Keep up the good work.
I want to thank Charlotte for sending that. And I want to say I'm so sorry to hear about the loss of your son. And I did send Charlotte a voicemail back. And I also wanted to say, it does not surprise me to hear about someone who has autism and these probably exceptional gifts figuring out how to communicate from the other side. Does this sound familiar?
Yeah, I mean, I also share your thoughts. Thank you to Charlotte for sending those in. Those are lovely, clear voicemails as well, as like she was in the interview with us. But they sound very, very much like ones that I've heard of before. I mean, ones where the phone rings and you pick up and you just hear static. When I was searching through articles and papers after I published Telephone Calls from the Dead, naturally, when you've done a book on any topic, or even if it's a biography for someone, you end up finding stuff after you've published. You always will. Nothing will ever be complete. You always find things. And I found an article by Renee Haynes, I think, who'd just I think it was one of the magazines for the SPR, one of the early ones, where they just talked about these bereavement-related telephone calls where people were just hearing the landline ring around the time that person had died, and on picking up there'd be no one there, or they'd pick up and they'd just hear static. So that's been very common all the way through to mobile phone technology as well. And both with the Rogo and Bayless study and my study, we found that the type 1 calls where someone has died, simple calls, someone has died, you pick up, you tend to just hear static, or sometimes just as a voice saying someone's name where they recognize that voice characteristic. And someone thinks that, oh my word, that was them. And that seems to be in the majority in terms of those types of calls. They're the most common ones. So certainly what Charlotte's mentioning there, I can certainly relate to one of the most popular call types.
In Telephone Calls from the Dead, you say, I must confess that I am 98% skeptical when it comes to anything in the field of EVP. And EVP is the thing that really excited me from the beginning when I first started learning about the paranormal. But I confess myself that I think I've become more skeptical over time when it comes to EVP. I was curious to know how you came up with that 98% and if you've changed since you wrote that 10 years ago.
Yeah, it's weird to hear yourself quoted on something you don't remember writing. I do remember some nights of writing it though. But why did I say 98? But,
at least you didn't have a decimal in there.
Yeah, I know. I think it's a fair reflection though. I've certainly listened to many, and I followed the history very seriously. I'm interested to know where it started and where it went to and where it is today. So I do get annoyed when I see the misquoting in a lot of books of people saying, well, here we have Dr. Konstantin Raudive, who was the discoverer of EVP, or here we have the Swedish filmmaker Fredrik Jurgenson, who was recording bird songs, and on playback he heard his deceased mother's voice. And that was in 1959. But it was Raymond Bayless. There have been many people that reported decades before that unusual voices coming on radios and sound systems, early speaker systems, but in an experimental setting of purposefully trying to record anomalous sounds, raps, scratches, and voices. Raymond Bayless was the discoverer. He started this around about 1954 and had rented an apartment in California and made it more or less a soundproof studio, and then was putting reel-to-reel recorders inside soundproof box with a psychic, someone who claimed they could astral project, someone called Attila Vanzele. Attila Vanzele went by Art Vanzele, so it was known as Art to most people. And the idea was they'd sit in silence and Art would try and project either his mental thoughts, impressions onto the tape, the magnetic tape, or try and encourage the, quote, spirits to do so. And sure enough, on playback, even though it had been inside a soundproof box and they said they were sitting in silence, they did get scratches and bangs and raps and odd voices on playback. And this was published as a report in 1959, a correspondence more than anything, so a letter to editor in the Journal of the American Society for Psychical Research. And Bayless was quite annoyed because no one really paid attention to it. Parapsychologists generally weren't interested in it. And that same year, that's when Friedrich Jurgenson, who had the media contacts, came forward and spoke about his experiences. So he is popularly known as this discoverer of EVP, when if you check the history, he isn't. I wrote a full chapter on the history to where we are now in the book Paracoustics that I edited with Steve Parsons. He added like 5 sentences on the end of this 30-page chapter that I spent an entire summer writing and going through the books and papers to actually get a really good, concise history going. And he slaps his name on the end of that chapter. I'm like, Steve, you didn't write this. He's cheeky. Anyway, I'm quite proud of that chapter. It's all mine. It's all mine, not Steve's. So I'm still very, very skeptical. I mean, even the more recent researchers, I think someone that spent the most considerable amount of time following Jurgenson was David Ellis. He had the Perrott Warwick Student Scholarship for 2 years, and he published reports along the way looking into this phenomena, and then self-published a book called The Mediumship of the Tape Recorder, in which his conclusions, spoiler alert, were essentially that a lot of this can be down to group suggestion, that if you think, did you hear the name Chris just then? Yes, I think I heard the name Chris. Yes, so did I. I think I heard that too. That you get this kind of conformity thing going on. It's a lot of the times it's this auditory pareidolia where your mind is trying to make sense of something. And if you've ever heard examples of EVPs, it could be through a presentation where a psychologist is trying to show you the pareidolia effect, or it could just even be on a TV program. You just hear nonsense. And then the moment someone says, oh, it sounds like leave the room, get out, I died here, that you might start to think, oh, yeah, it does sound a bit like that. Yeah, and you hear it more and more because of it. And so your brain is then finding some sort of sense within the nonsensical noise. We need to sometimes get some order out of chaos. And that's what goes on, really. When I was researching the telephone calls, which I find completely different because they're spontaneous, no one goes out to purposefully have one, they just happen. Some people did get voicemail messages. So you've got this permanent recording, and they sound just like any other voicemail that you might receive from someone, generally from the ones that I've heard. And yet there were remarkable stories attached saying, I think one of them particularly, they sent me a report of what happened and some photographs. And it was of their daughter who died suddenly of a brain hemorrhage, and the two parents had been separated for a while. And I think it was the father who said that he'd had an unusual voicemail come through. And so the mother came over to his house to listen in, and it come through that day, and it was their daughter on repeat going, hi, Dad. Hi, Dad. It could have been this, some sort of previous message or something, just looping it. But apparently it was either a brand new tape or one that had never left voicemails for him anyway, or something like that. I'd have to go back and find out what it was. But for them, it was just so unusual because it was out of character. They personally had found no reason for her voice to be on that particular voicemail machine. And so they sent me a cassette tape to listen to just, 15 minutes worth of Hi, Dad looping over and over again. But remarkable because, something's happened there. There are many conventional explanations we can put to some things. I mean, I remember once getting a text message from someone saying, "Why have you texted me saying you want to go and see that?" And I said, what are you talking about? I think it was like an ex-girlfriend of many years before. And she said, "Oh, this film." And I said, "That film's been out for like, 6 or 7 years now." And I said, I must have sent that ages ago. So that's been in cyberspace all this time and has just got to your phone. But then, that's where you then get this unlikely experience, because if I had died in that interim and then she got the text and, it wasn't to do with the specific film where you can realize there's a problem here, we've got a bit of a time lapse that doesn't make sense. If it was just a plain message about something, "See you soon, I love you," something like that, and it displays the person's name, of course that person might start to think that something very exceptional is going on and unusual, because you don't expect a text message to be hiding in cyberspace for not just a few days, but years. That doesn't sound right, but it does seem to happen. I've heard of accounts of it, not just for myself, but for other people. So yeah, the EVPs I find to be completely poles apart from the telephone anomalies. And I haven't personally heard many good EVPs. And unfortunately, many of these ghost hunting shows that I've never seen one display how an actual investigation of a haunting is conducted. It's just all TV creation. They're constantly using dictaphones and recording what they think are EVPs. And they seem to be getting more success than the scientists are in every half-hour show, which is amazing. Good luck to them.
Well, exactly. And you just gave me goosebumps, by the way, with Hi Dad. And even those conventional reasons for accidental things that make people think something paranormal is happening, or even like pareidolia itself, is so fascinating to me, whether it's paranormal or not.
Yeah.
But I have always, since I first started experimenting with it and blogging about it 10, 12 years ago, I get so annoyed. Like in modern days, we've been doing EVP and getting fascinated and being blown away by one-syllable freaking EVP. One syllable. That can be a scratch across the desk. That can be a burp. That can be anything. And it's like, I mean, if you're going to save that, or if you're going to document that, put them in this one syllable, not super fascinating, folder. Keep that aside and move on to the whole sentences, like stop being fascinated by one syllable EVP. Anything can sound like yes, or your name, if your name is a short name. So, that annoys me so much. But you're so right. And even though, the paranormal shows will still catch my attention, and I do enjoy watching some of them, and I do get super excited about, this Estes Method being so popular now. Like, I love that, but it's like, are we really researching things, or are we? Oh, you want to talk about the Estes Method, don't you?
That needs shooting as much as possible. That annoys me that name is even going around. So there is no such thing. It was even in the show that I did recently, Paranormal Captured Series 2, and I got so angry. We were mid-filming, and I was having to review the footage. I even spoke to the producers about this later, because they weren't to know. This is why they hire us in as experts, but they have just me and a behavioral expert. So psychotherapist, Angela, but she's not involved in parapsychology. So I'm the only parapsychologist on the show. And then you've got these people going out doing ghost hunts. And I saw this come up, someone being blindfolded and noise cancelling headphones or whatever they were using. And I said, "What's this again?" And they said, "Oh, it's the Estes Method." I said, "Where have they got that name from?" And I said, "Oh, we don't know. They just told us that's what it is." and so then I approached the people doing ghost hunting that are also featured in the show. And I said, "Where have you got this from?" And they said, "Oh, we just saw someone else do it in another show." And I said, "Stop it. This is people looking at pictures from parapsychology and thinking that looks great. Let's stick it in our ghost hunting." So I don't know where they've got the name from, but people need to really drop it. It is not Estes. It is called Ganzfeld, or the noise reduction model. And it started in the 1960s in psychology, and it's mainly been used for lab studies of telepathy and remote viewing. And you would lie back in a reclining chair, eye shields. You would have headphones on listening to relaxation induction and then reduced static. and you'd have a red light shining down, so it create this pink haze of vision, and it would induce hallucinations, and you wouldn't hear the static after a while. It would start to become conversations and all kinds of sounds that might relate to the induced hallucinations that you're having through the Ganzfeld method. And so there is someone within the ghost hunting arena, what these people call this public community for the paranormal, that has either named it after themselves or they've created this name and think that they're unique and they've discovered something when they haven't. This is complete kind of, what would you call it? Plagiarism of a method, really. And it achieves nothing. There's no rationale behind it like there would be in lab study. I got so angry when I saw the researchers, why am I calling them that even? When I saw them doing it, saying, do you know what you're doing? Do you know what you're doing if you have a bad trip with this? You're already in a location that's purportedly haunted, that is already putting you on edge. And then you're sending yourself through this procedure? Is there a counselor on hand? A psychotherapist, a psychologist, psychiatrist? Do you even know what this is going to achieve? What if you do have repercussions of actually going through this in a darkened location? You're not actually focused on any particular target or anything like that. No one's taking through any induction procedure or any debriefing afterwards. This is very reckless and just we shouldn't be pushing this as entertainment on a TV show. So I was then really shocked to find that other people had started doing it. So I would go on as many radio shows as possible to try and start to knock this down, because I just got so annoyed that there were some people that were doing this, and then heard from the people doing it saying, I don't care. I really don't care what the public think. And I don't care that I'm not using any recognized methods. It's not for me to educate people. And like, if you really got that devil may care attitude, I mean, how is that going to give reputation to anything? So yeah, Estes, that has really made my blood boil in recent times.
I am so happy to hear you say that, because I like to be schooled. And I am guilty of, first of all, finding it fascinating and referring to it as Estes Method and participating and maybe doing some live videos with it, things like that. So now I know. And you've also schooled me. I've been guilty of talking about Jurgenson and Raudive being the godfathers of EVP, and now I have some homework to do on that, and so I appreciate it.
Well, that one's more so just a historical argument in, tracing back to who's published the first report. And Raymond Bayless's one is hardly, if you're just going through the journals, easy to find. But this Ganzfeld method being used now, regularly seen on TV, the first thing that I just asked of anyone was, where have they seen that? Where has this come from? That was the only question that I wanted to ask. And no one could answer it. And I already had the answer. I just didn't know what the first TV portrayal was about this. They just said it'd been about in the last 2 or 3 years. So that there must be kind of some source to it. There's no point in going back to the original person now. They've done the damage and it started to spread by wildfire. But I think anyone that I see kind of using it really needs to be challenged on it, really, and get them to see if they actually have done their homework on it and whether they think it's safe or actually achieving anything. A lot of the stuff that we see, people label as an investigation or research, but I would always say, look, there's ghost hunting and, enjoying the thrill of going out and getting that ghost hunting experience that we might see in TV portrayals. And then we've got data collection and investigations. And investigations mean good rationales, a good kind of hypothesis or explanation as to why we're doing what we're doing, a way of collecting the data, a recognized way of analyzing that data, writing it up, present it to peer review, and it goes on record. All the investigations that I often see from kind of sectors of ghost hunting, that it's not an investigation because it doesn't produce anything. It doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't get presented to peer review. If I had my house burgled and the police came and did an investigation, I wouldn't be overly happy if they A, didn't produce a report, and B, just published it on their social media page. Pictures of my house and stuff like that. What's that going to achieve? Tell me about what you found and what you make of it, what the conclusions are. And then what do peers think about that as well that weren't involved, that have scrutinized your standards of data collection and the evidence that you've produced? That is science. That is investigation. That is going to check out a haunted location and various other anomalous experiences as well. So that's another gripe that I have with TV portrayals of ghost hunting. We're never going to get over that hill, because you said earlier there's this issue with an entertainment factor. If actual portrayals of science were given as whole shows, no one would watch them, because the actual enthusiasts do them because it's their career, it's their work, it's their interests. But is it entertaining to watch rather than being the person doing it? And quite frankly, it probably isn't. So we get all of these portrayals of night vision cameras and running about in the dark, a lot of people filming their faces rather than what's in front of them. And then all these special flashing gadgets and things like that, just things that we don't use. But they've certainly entertained a certain type of community for it. So yeah, I think the important thing, though, is this just re-educating, or saying, let's reel it in a little bit and let's talk about history and what's on record and what we actually do. So,
well, it's hard to hear, y'all, but let's be honest and check ourselves.
Check yourselves regularly.
Check yourselves regularly. And I've got some stuff to check too. And that's why we have Callum Cooper on the show, and should have had you on the show a long time ago to have ourselves checked.
It sounds harsh, doesn't it? I mean, I'm sorry, it sounds so harsh, but being a sort of an outsider to a lot of the public interest of it, and I love the public engagement, it's just I see some of these things happening before I have a chance to see or catch them. Things spread like wildfire in social media. And so you see these things going on. And Steve Parsons will tell you, as someone that's labeled as this gold standard of ghost hunting, that sometimes it's just really hard to get groups of ghost hunters to listen. They're not interested in someone being deemed a professional expert because they believe there is no such thing. And so they just want to go and do their own thing. They don't want someone to sit down and tell them how it is.
Well, some of them just aren't looking, and they don't know where to look because they've not wanted to. They haven't even put the time and effort to, look at original research or, listen to people in the know.
Yeah. And it is hard to find some of them, to be honest, because when people have unusual experiences, it is that Ghostbusters thing of who are you going to call? And people don't know to reach out to certain universities or societies and organizations that are involved in this. You do a Google search and you might get a local paranormal group that are just a group of people that are enthusiasts. And, I completely admit there might be groups in there that are trained counselors, and they might be educated scientists and things like that, and they have read. Others, though, are just following what they see on the TV, and that's it. And so, we have some that might be acting in a sort of a dangerous manner more than others, where actually what they're doing could be harmful to themselves and could be harmful to others. So it's a case-by-case basis, but I think it's important to constantly, what you're doing is fantastic. The fact we're on the 200th episode here is amazing. But educating people listening in and hearing about this, and then hopefully going to check out some of the books or the papers themselves. And beyond that, if they start to change their methods as well, how they go about doing things, fantastic. I couldn't ask for more than that. I think it was John Cleese said once, don't try and change the world. That's never going to happen. But if you can change the views in a good way, or the lives of someone, maybe 12 people at most, something like that, then you've done your duty. You've done a good thing if you've actually made people see something they never recognized before, or feel better about themselves in a way they never have before, or get them to see something that has actually changed the way they've done something to improve. That's the important thing. So if I'm doing that in some small way, at least, then I'm happy.
Well, and I love this, and I'm open to not being ignorant about a subject, because with you, I think people would hardly see you as a skeptic who's just out to poo-poo the paranormal, right? And you wouldn't see yourself as that, right?
No, there's a lot of assumption that skeptic means debunker, but that's where some movements of skepticism went wrong. You had PSYCOP, which was the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal, which then just became CSI, Committee for Skeptical Inquiry. And that was set up by Marcello Truzzi, who, within a few years of setting up the organization and people like James Randi getting involved, left the very organization he set up because he realized it was attracting a certain personality type, a certain individual that would label themselves as skeptics, but just be hard set to debunk everything and not actually apply good rational inquiry, not apply good critical thinking and say, well, what you should do is clue yourself up on the very topic you're going to investigate, look at all the fors, look at all the against, question the history and the sources. One writer is going to be different to the other, one researcher is going to be different to the other, and then take that forward with your current investigation. Don't go in the psychic that stepped forward asking you to challenge their claim, saying, well, you're not going to do well because there's no such thing as psychic phenomena, which you might have in your mindset. You've got to learn to put that to one side and send them through recognized methods. Put your stuff to peer review, get other people's perspectives involved. And so that translates all the way through to haunting investigations. I'm fascinated by people's claims of ghosts and hauntings, but I will look into that claim. I'm interested to go along. I want to see what experiences people have. I want to know the history of the place and the eyewitness testimony from people that have been there. So I'm just looking for good methods and good ability to assess the data and form conclusions from that as well. I'm not out to try and dismiss. That's not the point.
Well, I want to make sure I have plenty of time for you to educate us on your work with bereavement and recovery. I was a little out of the loop and had no idea of your research with this, and was a little surprised to hear that this actually falls into your world of parapsychology. So share a little bit about what your work looks like.
Yeah, so I suppose we could say that there's three different branches of parapsychology in a way, or looking into anomalous claims. So one is, we've discussed parapsychology a lot. So that is the science of looking into purported abilities and experiences of people that appear to be currently outside of the realms of conventional scientific paradigms, scientific thinking. So they're pushing at those boundaries and certainly suggesting a post-materialist view of science. So seeing future events before they happen or acting on intuitions and they turn out to be correct. Telepathic experiences, seeing apparitions and interacting with them that display conscious awareness, all these kinds of things. So that would be parapsychology, questioning these claims, challenging these claims, running lab studies to test for psychic ability amongst the general population, while also being completely aware of the many conventional explanations that other areas of psychology and science can bring to explain why people might have these experiences. Then there's anomalistic psychology, which is looking at the psychology of belief into the paranormal, that again looks at all these conventional explanations that lead to people assuming they've had a strange experience, when actually, let's look at it from this angle, no, they haven't. It's just all built up around these other things that create this idea that they have, and that's the way they've interpreted it. But still, anomalistic psychology is not opposed to doing lab studies and challenging these claims. It's just more so focused on this other side. And then there's this third branch where we say, you know what, regardless of where the experience has come from, its origins, let's actually look at the person that's made the claim. What has the experience done for their life? How does it benefit them? Why have they had it? What does it do to their health and well-being? So this would be called clinical parapsychology. I suppose it started to gain traction really in the 1980s, where there were offices of counseling parapsychology, particularly one in Freiburg, set up. So counseling for people who have had anomalous experiences. And certainly within the last 10 or 15 years, a lot more focus has been had on bereavement, people having what's known as after-death communication experiences, post-death experiences, where they believe that they've had experiences specifically of loved ones after they've passed away. Indeed, there's also cases where people have had experience of deceased individuals that they didn't know, and then followed it up, and it turned out to be, someone could recognize the person that they said that they'd envisioned as this apparition. This all began a long time ago because the Society for Psychical Research had analyzed cases of apparitions seen soon after death and looked at their commonality, how often people reported them, what they were like. When you turn to books on death, dying, and bereavement, this common sort of label for the study of death, dying, and bereavement in the United States that I like to use from the Greek god Thanatos, so of thanatology, is looking at these areas. But textbooks in the 1950s, they didn't really recognize people having sense of presence phenomena. If you were lucky, you might find the odd few sentences within such textbooks mentioning it. By the late 1960s, there was a general practitioner. So when you go to your local doctor before you go to the hospital, he was living in North Wales, a guy called William Dewi Rees, so Dewi being the Welsh equivalent of David. Dewi Rees was doing research, even though he was a GP, very unusual because a GP is usually just in practice, but he liked conducting research and getting it published in medical journals and thanatology journals. And he wanted to just gain more recognition with the research community. So even though he already held the status as doctor from his qualifications in general practice, he went to King's College London and did a MD, medical doctorate thesis. And I think it was within the domain of psychiatry because of the topic area. That's the best place for him, so one of his supervisors found. And he was initially looking at the negative outcomes of bereavement and just wanted to explore them really within the scope of a thesis. And he'd interviewed 293 widows and widowers. Towards the end of his interviewing, some of them said, oh yeah, and after they passed away, I still felt them around me. So he thought, well, this is unusual, went back to his entire cohort and re-interviewed them and asked them specifically about these sense of presence experiences. And over 50% of the people involved said that they'd had them. So he looked into these further. And that became the basis for his MD thesis, completely changed the main topic area from negative side effects to these hallucinations of widowhood. And within the same year of his thesis being completed, he wrote a summary paper that got published in the British Medical Journal. So this really kick-started kind of science's approach to medicine and also awareness for these experiences amongst medical practitioners. And probably from there till about when I started my thesis in 2012, another 15 doctorates had focused on these experiences in some way, and more papers have come out. It's still widely under-researched in many ways, but we've done a lot to really kind of push forward with it. So I was just involved in the latest, biggest survey on this. So Dewi Reza's one has been widely recited time and time again because it's a big survey beyond the initial stuff of the SPR. Our recent survey that came out went in the British Journal of Psychiatry Open. And we did a survey that was in English, French, and Spanish languages. So we had a wide reach, and we're eventually going to move it through to German soon as well. But we initially gained over 1,000 people who took part in the questionnaire, and it took over 40 minutes to complete. We got them to talk about every possible aspect of ADCs that we knew on record that people might encounter. So the survey was designed to skip questions where it completely didn't relate to them, dreams of the deceased, smelling the deceased, hearing the deceased, all those kinds of things. And we'll focus on their own specific experiences, but they could also write about them as well. So that's been the main focus of my research. We've funded for another 2 or 3 years of research on these surveys, and we'll keep going after that because there's so much more ground to charter, and we've also got more data to analyze, and we need to start getting some more papers out based on what data we already have in. So I teach on death, dying, and bereavement. That's obviously because of parapsychology as well, been one of my main focuses of interest. What are these experiences that people have? How do they impact your health and well-being?
As a world, we're speaking of recovery. We're kind of recovering from a pandemic. And if you look at history, different periods of time where there were a lot of lives lost, I wonder if, the pandemic has affected your work with bereavement and recovery.
That's a really good question. And I hope we've really jumped on the bandwagon in the right way, because one of my colleagues, he did his undergraduate degree at Northampton because of parapsychology, and he did his dissertation on apparitions. And he spent several years out working in nursing and the prison services. And he's decided to come back and do a PhD, wanted to work on apparitions further, and was looking for a sort of a niche. How could his proposal be different and look at an area not yet explored? And I said, well, it'd be good to actually lean on parapsychology more and look at cases where people have seen people within a 24-hour period of their death. So we call these the crisis period, and they perhaps didn't know someone was dying that they close to, that they love. Messages received, they're very specific perhaps from the apparition, and the person had to follow up that information. It turned out to be correct. Or multiple witnesses to the same apparition as well. They're interesting. I said, so those would be great to be explored further. How about you do it within the context of COVID-19 and lockdown periods where people were spending a long time inside their homes? Because this is quite comparable to when we had the first, second, and maybe third, if we can identify where they are in the timeline of history, rises of spiritualism. Certainly the second one was argued to be World War I, where, again, a lot of people were suffering this mass amount of loss of people that had gone off to war. You were lucky if you even got a letter home to say that they had been found dead. Some people were just completely missing in action and no body was recovered. So families didn't get that resolved. They didn't get that chance to say goodbye, and just loads of unanswered questions. I've seen from the news over the time in COVID, it was very common for people to have a relative taken off to hospital with a slight cough or something like that. And within a week, they were dead.
Right.
And because of the COVID restrictions, you weren't allowed to go and visit. And you also had to stay in your home.
Right.
So it could be very comparable to these previous times, but we'd need to collect the data specifically in this period to understand about these ADCs compared to ADCs over time. Is there a richer quality to them? And also what's happened in the bereavement and coping aspect from having these experiences within a time of loss and unanswered questions as well.
One nerdy, quick last question before I let you give some final thoughts. But do I or do I not build a psychomantium? I've been very inspired by Raymond Moody.
Yeah.
Do I do it or not? Do I annoy my husband and move stuff out of a closet and make a closet a psychomantium?
I think if you're going to do it and do it at home, I wouldn't recommend, if this is kind of groups of people for fun, do it at home and tell your husband that you're going into the psychomantium for no more than half an hour if you want to. But just be careful that it doesn't get to you too much. I mean, a really basic form of playing around with that kind of thing is just going to a room with the lights off, but you can still see from the street lights or any other lights that are about clearly what's in the room, but it's just dark and things aren't clear. But if there's a mirror hanging in the room, go up to it. You might see that a lot of your face is shadow, but you can still sort of make out your eyes, your nose, your mouth, eyebrows, and so forth. But you're not overly clear. You want that sort of near enough dark room. Just stare into that mirror. That'll do it. I've been to so many haunted locations over time where, there would be a room with a mirror, and day and night I'd be wandering around the place. But if it was nighttime and the lights went on, acting as a security guard, essentially just walking from room to room, just checking the place out, I sometimes would stare into those mirrors and you would see things change after a while. If you stared long enough, it has its origins back to ancient Egypt and people staring into darkened pools of water in caves and places like that, and they would see their image change, thinking that they're interacting with the dead or getting divine messages from the gods. And then this later moved through to scrying, darkened glass, and staring into the darkened glass for these messages, and then on to crystal ball gazing as well. So you've got this scrying throughout time, and then psychomantium's this modern version where we could induce an after-death communication through a room full of dimly lit mirrors. And there's other techniques as well. But yeah, if you're under supervision, someone else, just to say enough now, I think you've had enough. Maybe, but it's one of those things that I don't like to overly encourage. I think, there are places where you could certainly go and have a go under the appropriate supervision. So the University of West Georgia, for example, my colleague there, now Professor Christine Simmons-Moore, glad I got that in there. She's been working on psychomantium, and now I'm so glad she's about to start on the flotation tanks as well as me. She'd seen the pilot that we'd done and got really excited about it. So they're just about to start on flotation tanks, but they've been doing psychomantium as well. So there are a few places that you could go to actually experience an official setup with people that have been working on this for a while and producing papers.
Well, don't get too excited, because I've said that I was going to try this for years and haven't. It's a rabbit hole that I can, it's so fascinating to me. People, if you have not looked up scrying or the psychomantium and the different research going on with that is so cool.
See, you don't have to go that far. Just try a basic form of scrying. Just get a handheld mirror.
Yeah.
One that's big enough, I don't know, 8 inches by 8 inches, something like that, where you could see perfect reflection back of your own face, and just sit in a darkened room and have a look at that for a bit. And you'll get the general principle of what goes on there.
Okay, I'm going to do it. I want you to have a chance to give any final thoughts. And, now oh my gosh, you said flotation, and I completely forgot that you've been working on that. And I know that I've got people interested in that. That could be a whole other episode, but give us any of your final thoughts where, people should go to find you. I know is your site still CallumECooper.com?
It certainly is. So there you go. You've advertised that. And my Twitter account is the same, at Callum E. Cooper. And also, if you go to Amazon and type in my name, you'll find my books on there. I've also done a lot of forwards recently. So the book by Alex Tannis, Psy in Psychotherapy, I wrote the introduction to that and edited the whole book. But I wrote the introduction with Professor Stanley Krippner, and we had Professor Adrian Parker to write the afterword. And then also with Craig Weiler, he wrote Psy Wars, and he did a second edition. And now I've got confused because people were playing about so much with Craig's surname, Wheeler Weiler, that I'm wondering which one I've got stuck in my head now, as whether I've got the incorrect pronunciation of his surname. But Craig Weiler. I did the forward to his book about this exposure of problems with Wiki and the James Randi Prize and TED Talks that were banned. And as a journalist, he's a building contractor by day, but as a journalist, he just got really fascinated into this closure of information on such data and the science. And I'm also exploring, I guess, that as this journalist, what is the psychology to people that have this absolute disbelief, where they might reject stuff on grounds that don't really seem to make sense when you have a good look at them. They're acting under this banner of rationalism and skepticism, and they don't seem to be either, or relate to people that are skeptics working within the field. Certainly, I, as a skeptic, wouldn't want to associate with many of these people that refer to themselves as skeptics, because I wouldn't want to confuse the public that we have the same mindset. I think it's a complete misuse of skepticism, and I teach many classes on skepticism and get students to use it in all the studies they do of all kinds of psychology. So Craig had done a really good digging exercise there, and because it's from a journalist perspective, it's a really good read in terms of what he found and his own thoughts and experiences on this sort of adventure of exposure, and I suppose a debunking exercise in many ways. So yeah, I wrote the forward to the second edition, so that's Psy Wars.
Excellent. I could talk to you for 3 or 4 or 7 more hours, but it would be the middle of the night for you, and it would be time for your alarm clock to wake you up for work. So we totally have to end it at some point, but I so appreciate it. You rock, sir.
Oh, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure being on the show and speaking to you. I'm sure we'll have many more chats, and we'll talk about the flotation tank as well.
Oh, let's plan it.
Yep, we'll do it.
Welcome to Spectral Edition Railroad Extra. Who doesn't love the sound of a steam train whistle? And who doesn't love a ghost story? Well, I put those two together and began researching historical railroad hauntings. I found enough really interesting stories to put together a book that is titled After the End of the Line, Railroad Hauntings in Literature and Lore. It's filled with all kinds of stuff. Some of it's fiction, there's a little bit of poetry, but there's also true ghost stories, and some of them are straight out of newspapers. The book is finished, but my interest in this stuff has not faded at all. I continue to look up old newspaper reports, but now I do it with an eye toward haunted locations that a person can still visit. Take a railroad tunnel, for instance. There's a good chance that a railroad tunnel built 150 years ago is still there. As I come across new historical articles about railroad hauntings, I blog about them on a series called Railroad Hauntings You Can Still Visit. They're on my website, brownbonesbooks.com. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. On January 4th of 1887, several hours before sunrise, it was a very cold night. There was a passenger train running from New York to Chicago. Meanwhile, near the tiny town of Republic, Ohio, there was a freight train that had stalled on the single track. And the speeding passenger train was on that very same track as the stalled freight train. There was a terrible wreck. One of the newspaper reports that I found said that the engine telescoped into the baggage car, while the other cars piled up on one another as high as a house. There was a smoking car on the passenger train, and that caught fire. In the end, about 19 people died, either from the impact itself or from being trapped in the flames. Now that's what happened. Exactly why it happened, I don't think anybody knows. I certainly wasn't able to figure it out in my research. But there was a curve in the track right there by the town of Republic, and I imagine that the engineer of the passenger train came around that curve and suddenly saw a freight train sitting there in front of him. The freight train was really the target of blame. They should have been waiting on what's called a siding. It's a little track off to the side. They knew the passenger train was coming, but the conductor, a man named F. Fletcher, thought he could at least make it to Republic before the passenger train arrived. There's one report that says that the bitter cold caused the steam train to stall on the curve, and by the time the conductor had gotten out to signal the passenger train, it was just too late. There's another report that says that the freight engine wouldn't have stalled at all if its engineer hadn't been, and I quote, hilariously intoxicated. Strange choice of words considering the outcome. Now, a couple months later, there are a number of Ohio newspapers that all ran exactly the same report. Let me read that for you. This comes from the Ohio Democrat on March 12th of 1887. The headline is, Ghost Stopping Trains. The railroad employees at Republic, Ohio excited over danger signals that are displayed near the late accident by unseen hands. Tiffin, Ohio, March 3rd. The village of Republic has a ghost, which stops trains, and there is great excitement there. A few nights ago, when Express Number 5, the same train that was wrecked January 4th, not exactly the same train, just the same schedule, when that train was approaching the scene of that horrible disaster, the engineer saw a red light, the danger signal ahead. And applying the brakes and reversing the engine, the train came to a standstill on almost the exact spot of the great wreck. Strange to say, when the train came to a stop, the light had disappeared and could nowhere be seen. Before stopping, both the engineer and fireman, the guy who feeds the fire, noticed that the light appeared to be carried by a woman in white. Puzzled by the disappearance of the signal, the conductor walked over the track for some distance ahead, but could discover nothing. The train then backed to the Republic station, and the operator was questioned, but he assured them that no signal had been sent out. The train then proceeded on its way cautiously, the engineer keeping a sharp lookout, but nothing more was seen of the mysterious woman. This strange apparition has appeared on 3 occasions and has greatly excited trainmen. A posse has watched the place for several nights, but the ghost has not since appeared. I was really hoping that I could find a follow-up article that explained what that posse found. I don't think they were there looking for a ghost. I think they were there looking for a hoaxer. But I couldn't find anything. All that I found in terms of follow-up came 130 years or so later on the internet. I found a few reports that on that stretch of track, people much more recently have seen not a woman in white carrying a red danger signal, but an entire phantom train. I have links available on my website, but I also found another article much earlier, much closer to when the wreck happened, and it's not a ghost story, but it does have a certain Twilight Zone feel to it. Let me read that for you. This comes from a newspaper called the Springfield Daily Republic. It was published on January 14th of 1887, so just about a week and a half after the accident. The headline is The Tiffin Horror. A Springfield man, an eyewitness to the accident and narrowly escapes himself. Mr. Charles St. John of North Market Street, this city, who is now traveling for the Ohio Valley Coffin Company of Lawrenceburg, Indiana, arrived home yesterday from a trip through the northern part of Ohio. Mr. St. John was an eyewitness of the frightful railroad accident on the B&O at Republic, Ohio, near Tiffin, a week ago last Tuesday morning, in which 18 people met with horrible deaths. Mr. St. John came within a hair's breadth of being a passenger on the ill-fated train, and he would probably have been among the killed, for it is his invariable habit to ride in the smoking car. The night of the accident, it occurred about 3 o'clock in the morning, Mr. St. John stopped at a small country town named Fort Washington, a short distance above Republic, Ohio. He was working his way down through the little towns in that vicinity to Lima, Ohio. The night of the wreck was a bitter cold one, but Mr. St. John had several places to make the next day, and left orders for the clerk at the little public house at Fort Washington to call him in time for the train. Just before going to bed, Mr. St. John told the clerk that, as it was so awfully cold, he wouldn't feel very bad if he didn't call him. Providentially for Mr. St. John, the clerk failed to call him, and the train passed on through. The news of the terrible wreck reached Fort Washington soon after it occurred, and the greatest excitement reigned. All the guests at the hotel, including Mr. St. John, went to Republic on a made-up train and worked like horses to succor the dying and extricate the dead. Mr. St. John says the horrors of the wreck were not exaggerated in the papers in the least, and that the human mind cannot conceive of the sights and sounds heard and witnessed there as the dull, dark day dawned. He helped lay the dozen or more charred trunks in a row and saw the unfortunate man from Washington, D.C., burned to death alive, inch by inch. Mr. St. John's firm furnished the coffins in which the bodies were buried. Just an odd little story connected to the saga of a train wreck and the ghosts that came after it. If you happen to live in the vicinity of Republic, Ohio, you can still go to that curve in the train tracks. I found it on Google Maps. I also found several other locations that have haunted railroads, railroad tunnels, railroad tracks, railroad stations. You can learn about them on my website, brombonesbooks.com. Go to the page for After the End of the Line, Railroad Hauntings in Literature and Lore, scroll down just a bit, and look for railroad hauntings you can still visit. Who knows, maybe you'll find something ghostly near you. This has been Spectral Edition. Railroad Extra. You know, I'm starting to like that. Thank you very much for listening. I'm Tim Prasil.
Thank you to the following super paranerds who support the show at patreon.com/Big Seance. Shay Robin, Daryl, Anne-Marie Sullivan, Genesis, Natalie N., Kim Robb, Josie L. Lorenzo, Susan Davey, and Amy Park Gedicke. My supporters at the parlor guest level, who can be found at bigseance.com/parlorguests, are Miranda from SpookyLittleHalloween.com, Linda from ShimmeringMoons.com, Ann Rekovich from OzParatech.com, Denise Sia from Raven Haunts Paranormal, Janae Michaels from Grey House Tarot and Farm Artifacts, Chelsea from Cheers with Chelsea, Mitchell Coombs from MitchellCoombs.com, Sarita Cockerham, Christine Rath Selhi, Christine Ferrens, Mindy Kintop, Hope Battaglia, Cassie Keller, Melissa Armour, Diane Rax, Nettie, Dina DeCastro of Dina DeCastro Astrology, Bruce Williams, Christopher Kohler, Lana and John of Carbon Lilies, Jim Budd, David Rubenstein, and Norman and Linda Keller. That sound you just heard was the above and beyond. There's not even a category for your level of support fireworks display. Because I have 6 awesome listeners who continue to support the show at the $10 level. Peggy Hagan, Glenna Becker, Steve Skinner, Kevin Gilbert, AJ Meredith, and James Wilfong. So thank you, Peggy, Glenna, Steve, Kevin, AJ, and James, and thank you, Paranerds. For show notes, including links to anything we may have mentioned in this episode, visit bigseance.com. And you can continue the discussion and hang out with a great community of paranerds by joining us in the Big Seance Parlor on Facebook. Want to hear your voice in a future episode? Go to bigseance.com/feedback to learn how. Thank you so much for listening. Unfortunately, it's time to blow the candles out, but we'll see you and light them again next time.